Welcome to Capital Forum's Thought Leaders interview series. I'm Sarah Morrison, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Leslie Overton, partner and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Apologize
No, that's fine.
at Axinn. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me.
And so I guess let's start off with something broader than a little bit specific at the same
Yeah.
time, which is how do you characterize the current administration's enforcement environment for private equity, and how do you compare it with previous administrations?
Thank you for the question. So I feel that the current environment, the administration, they're skeptical. They're very
Mm-hmm.
skeptical of the private equity financing model. They collapse it with a business model that competes in a particular way, and you could even say, I think, that there's a level of hostility,
Mm-hmm.
at least in the rhetoric. And so I think we are seeing enforcement, but we're not seeing enforcement that is happening just in a we're doing this enforcement because of these particular allegations. Again, it's in this broader context
Mm-hmm.
where there's this suggestion that there is something concerning about the private equity
Mm-hmm.
model. And that's also happening in the broader context of, we've got books out there that are comparing private equity to pirates and robber barons and all sorts of,
Mm-hmm.
other, just awful things. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what private equity contributes to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would actually like to see is for the agencies to be, in terms of the leadership, to be less heated in their rhetoric and less focused on what they see as these, anecdotes of bad behavior, and more balanced in their approach.
And how does that compare with previous administrations and I guess their rhetoric or lack thereof about this?
So I will say, in during the Obama administration, we there was a change to the HSR rules that was intended to capture a perceived gap with respect to private equity.
Mm-hmm.
But when you looked at, for example, the remedies manual that was put out during that administration, it didn't specifically say that private equity divestiture buyers were disfavored or anything like that. It didn't mention private equity at all. It did say that the division was looking for a someone who was going to compete long term with the assets.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you fast forward to the Trump administration, and under Macon Delrahim, my former colleague, they updated the remedies manual in 2020, and they had the same language or similar language about looking for buyers who would compete long term with the assets, but they also indicated that a private equity buyer would be, or candidate buyer would be considered, under the same in the same way that a non-private equity buyer would be considered,
Mm-hmm.
and a private equity buyer could be a preferred buyer. It didn't say it would be a preferred buyer, but it made clear that there wasn't something about private
Mm-hmm.
equity that was inconsistent with competing aggressively.
Mm-hmm.
And Macon actually did a speech at the Georgetown conference, where he tried to, I think, educate the public and talk about the changes that have happened in private equity in business models
Mm-hmm.
over the years, and how private equity is now more compatible with what or the division is looking for. And so I think he took the approach of, let's try to look at everything on a case by case
Mm-hmm.
basis.
So you think, yeah, the current administration is just making an assumption that these things are bad, without sort of looking at specifically why they might or might not be doing that for private equity in a way that they're not doing it for other firms or industries.
So I was on a panel yesterday
Mm-hmm.
talking about private equity, and one of my friends from DOJ, who's now at the FTC, was there, and he was saying that, agencies are looking at all of this
Mm-hmm.
on a case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the statement he made. But and if that's true, it's not lining up with the rhetoric that we're hearing. And so, I give an example of the workshop that the FTC did last month.
Right.
And so they did a workshop on private equity in healthcare. And there was in the intro, Lena Khan she acknowledges some potential positive things about private equity. She does that, but then she goes on to talk about these alleged awful outcomes, and then the slate of speakers ends up being steered in a particular direction. So I think yes, they, in theory, perhaps they're doing things more on a case-by-case basis than it looks, but it's not lining up with the rhetoric.
Okay. I mean, do you feel like the enforcement actions that they have taken or might be taken are lining up with either what they're saying or what you think they're doing?
Well, again, to the extent, I don't want to get into the details too much of any particular action, but I would say to the extent they have a concern about, let's say, a roll-up strategy, and they think a particular firm has engaged in an anti-competitive roll-up strategy, that's not something unique to private equity. First of all private equity doesn't use that particular strategy. Second, there are a number of private equity firms who use that strategy in a pro-competitive way. You can have a roll-up of a lot of acquisitions in an unconcentrated industry that is still unconcentrated, and where you end up having a lot of efficiencies and end up promoting growth and spreading knowledge and expertise. So a roll-up strategy, while it has become a bad word, is not anti-competitive in and of itself. But to the extent the FTC has concerns about certain roll-up strategies, it doesn't need to be tied to private equity, because a public company could do a roll-up strategy. A company that's privately held but not backed by private equity, they could do a roll-up strategy. It's not, we don't need to combine those two things.
And well, so why do you think that it seems like private equity is being targeted here more than other things? Is it that they feel like they're making up for past mistakes, or like they weren't aggressive enough about when these companies are sort of coming forward, or is it just kind of maybe looks good to say you're going after companies that there's a lot of coverage that says that they're destroying various maybe industries?
So I think there is a lot of scapegoating and stereotyping with respect to private equity, and I do think there are members of the public who do believe that private equity is responsible for their favorite clinic shutting down or something like that. And so, or they think private equity is responsible for them having to work more hours, but not necessarily. Those individuals may just not understand there are other factors going on. Healthcare is a really difficult space, and there are other dynamics that are putting pressure on providers. And we don't know, there may be providers that would have died on the vine but for private equity investment, but for private equity making some difficult cuts. Again, private equity they're not the only business model or financial model where there are reductions in force. There are plenty of public companies that do reductions in force when they feel it's necessary to put a company on solid footing. And so I think I do believe, I know the agencies have heard complaints about private equity, and I've seen the videos of people blaming private equity on things. But again, it's not private equity. We need to think about the implications of having a system where a lot of these providers are dependent on public payers, on Medicare and Medicaid, which is leaving a shortfall in reimbursement. And at the same time, they're dealing with staffing shortages. They're dealing with increased tech and equipment costs, and they're trying to do all of that. And there are a lot of providers, like I said, that are going under. And we're not hearing the stories about how private equity has saved healthcare for lots of communities. And I want to hear a more balanced approach. And I'll say, when I was at the DOJ the first time during the Bush administration, I had responsibility for the joint healthcare hearings the agencies did. And we did months of hearings, and then we put together a report at the end. And we were very intentional about choosing speakers that would represent a diverse range of views. And we did that because we were interested in using those hearings to actually learn what was going on, learn what had changed, so it could inform our policy and so it could inform our enforcement. And I felt that the workshop last month was more designed almost as advocacy as opposed to for learning or education.
I mean, do you feel like the administration, maybe in general, has been a little bit more about advocacy, maybe previous ones or ones that you have, worked for?
So I do think there are different subjects where they are particularly focused on advocacy, but the Obama administration was focused on advocacy in different ways. During the Bush administration, there was a particular effort to move Section 2 law. So each administration has priorities. My point about the hearings and the workshop was just if you're going to do a workshop, it's an opportunity to learn, and especially when you are making statements that do not seem to be based on empirics. And so I think that's what's challenging. Some of the things that we're hearing about the so-called problems with private equity. They focus on short-term profits. Lots of public companies focus on short-term profits, and so how are you distinguishing between that focus on short-term profits versus private equity focus on short-term profits? And lots of companies that are private equity focus on short-term profits and are still very, very aggressive in competing. And some of them are also less short-term. Some of them are longer term. So it's just not. I want to know what are the studies that are forming the basis for this particular rhetoric. And I think I would like to see them do more of that.
So without those, or without many of them, and with like you said, a sea change here, how are you advising clients when it comes to dealing with this? Like, is it unpredictable? Is there, like, I guess, just what are you telling them, and what are they asking you?
So I certainly am telling clients that private equity is in the crosshairs, despite what I mentioned, I heard from my co-panelist. And I'm also telling them to be intentional and thoughtful and accurate when it comes to the types of documents they create, because they want to put themselves in a good position to be appropriately understood and not misunderstood or mischaracterized, perhaps even years down the line when they're trying to do a deal and someone comes out with something. And I'll give an example. There was an enforcement matter at the FTC using prior approval back in 2022 involving some energy companies in the crude oil space. And one of them had a document that the FTC liked so much they put it in the press release. And it said something along the lines of, "We're going to take over the world," and then "world" was crossed out, and it said Utah. So it's a cartoon, with some little cartoon character, and that may have been hilarious to the people who wrote it, but people at the agencies, I have, like I said, lots of friends at both agencies. They have wonderful senses of humor in their individual capacities, but no sense of humor as enforcers, and so it did, it just companies can help themselves a lot. I tell them it's a gift to their future selves to be really thoughtful, careful, and accurate about their documents. And if they do have a so-called roll-up strategy, they're not going to use that word, given I said that's now a bad word. But talk about why you're doing it, what you're going to gain, the great things that are going to come out of it for your customers, the great things that are, or for your patients or for whomever, but how it's going to be pro-competitive and why that strategy helps the pro-competitive outcome. So rather than it looking like you're out for world domination. So I think that is, and then I'm also talking to them about things like the FTC's prior approval approach, and so that is challenging. So it's much harder in this administration to have a reasonable pro-competitive remedy in a merger matter. There's a lot more hostility toward remedies,
Yeah.
but the FTC has been willing to do them in some cases with this prior approval requirement where they get essentially a veto right over certain future deal activity. And that is to me raises such challenges in terms of just due process, and it's also difficult as a practical matter for the company, because if you have a company who signs on to one of those and then they want to do a deal in the future, first of all they have to count on the FTC to investigate their deal. Who knows how long the FTC will take to do that, because they're not under any time pressure. Then if they do investigate it, they've got to count on them to actually decide that it's not a problem, without having to think about proving it to a judge later or anything like that. And then even if something is so wonderful that you think the FTC would approve it under a prior approval, if a company goes into a competitive bid situation with that kind of burden on them, what seller is going to want to choose the company that has a prior approval requirement? They would much rather choose a company where the process is much more predictable.
Okay. And then I guess, sort of speaking of predictability, there might be a new administration a year from now. There might not be. Is there anything you're doing to prepare for that possibility? Or you look at and what the landscape could be? Because I assume a lot of things would change within the agencies if it does. Or are you just going to wait and see what happens?
So I think that some things would change. I do think. I do think it's possible on private equity, for example, that if you had somebody come in, they might take more of an approach like Macon did, but you can't guarantee that. And so I will say, having been in DOJ under not just different administrations, but under different assistant attorneys general, everybody has their own approach, even within the same party. And so you could get somebody who comes in and they say, I actually like this, all this rhetoric about private equity, and I have a problem with private equity. So you can't say for sure, oh, something will flip this way. I mean, I know there are some people who think, for example, if the administration changes, that the merger guidelines are going by the wayside. But and that could happen. That could certainly happen. But I don't think you can count on that. Now, it might be that they get utilized a little bit differently at the edges, but I don't think you can count on that. I think what I primarily focus on, again, is just having people be really, really smart, like I said, on documents, because that's going to help you in any administration. Having them have very reasonable expectations in terms of timing. And so, so if that changes in an administration where we see something that might be going a little bit faster or something like that. But the truth is, I expect actually we're going to have more challenges on timing going forward
Hmm.
if the changes that the agencies want to put through on the HSR form go through. And so again, they may get sued, and those may never see the light of day. But if they are able to get them implemented, I think they will add so much burden both to the HSR filing process, so that will take a lot longer. But I also think that there will be more matters that raise no issues that still get a preliminary investigation
Mhm.
because there's something in that file now that it's so expansive.
Right.
There's something that catches the eye of someone on staff and they feel they need to run it down.
Mhm.
And so I think it will add that kind of delay.
Well, on that happy note, thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it. Interesting discussion. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much
All
for
right.
the opportunity.
All right.
Take care.